Thank you, Joe.
And yeah,
All righty then. Welcome all. This is the 10th of June, and uh, and it's this and that. And I'm just wanting to review, perhaps convince people that they actually should get down and read Volume One of Capital. We're doing a little review because there's an up and coming Andy Higginbottom uh, lecture that will be lecture 5 or 6 or whatever it is in the volume 2 lecture series, but since it is fairly technical, probably have to review number 1. Where's my Zoom boxes? What Zoom boxes? How's that? Is that better?
it was just dialogue boxes or whatever blocking the screen share.
We okay? We better now? Oh, I see.
You still have one in the lower middle.
Lower middle. I wonder if it's this one. Maybe it's this one. Or this one.
That first one, I think.
Probably this one.
That looks good.
No. Is that good?
Oh, it popped back up. Shoot.
Oh, damn it.
It was all good for a moment there. They got the little ones back.
That's good.
Are we good now?
It just popped back.
How's that?
It's Zoom Tetris.
Fuck. Jesus. How's that?
Looks good for me.
We okay now?
Yeah.
All righty. 10th of June. God, how time flies. Anyway, so we're going to begin at the beginning again. And it's very necessary, actually, considering that a lot of ink has been spilled. Wading through the very simple problems, what the difference is between use value and exchange value, and you sort of have to work that out, not only for yourself, but perhaps within the context of people's reading of it. There's simple ways of approaching it, and there's some books that consider simple ways of doing it. But I think once you get a handle on this idea of the difference between use value and exchange value, and that the default, of course, is use value relative to one's personal survival, but that exchange value, like with the social contract and all these other sorts of things, is what it's what makes people human. This thing that we can see operating within animal behaviors as a kind of a cooperation or sociobiological interaction is enhanced by the fact that we have other tools, one of which is language. Now, that's not to say that there isn't language-like behavior going on in so-called species below or other than humans, but it is pretty much the dominant feature of the awful movement towards climate calamity that we should blame and worry about. But the categorization of it, I think, is important. It's become somewhat popular to say that today's economy has changed so much that we're no longer in an age of neoliberalism, or even if you believe Yanis Varoufakis, capitalism. That's that kind of thing to talk about techno-feudalism or whatever the hell he was talking about. But the direction in which we've been pointed by the gig economy's pricing models is actually in many ways neoliberalism's apotheosis, where each of us is a number evaluated by various algorithms with our behaviors used to inform our prices without our even knowing it. Some of us have complained about how the YouTube algorithm works and how Google's algorithms work. And yes, it is quite annoying. And in fact, it is not necessarily a price signal, but it actually kind of is. And the interesting article in the American Prospect is about surge pricing and the gig economy. And it's actually a useful little article. I mean, it uses essentially Uber and Lyft as a kind of the scapegoats or the straw people in this particular argument. But it's worth a read to get a sense of that, all is not well in these kinds of manipulations. The recent New York governor's decision to put off or delay the implementation of surge pricing is likely simply an election year thing. That's what I've assumed that it is, and it's going to happen one way or the other. If you read the articles on it, that it is sort of kind of statutory, and that it's going to happen one way or the other. That is, it's already sealed in, and whatever delaying tactic she's put in, as I said, likely for election year purposes, the thing's still going to happen. And it may not happen in this election year. I think what will happen is next year, and all of the foundational elements are already in place. So I wouldn't get too annoyed about what the governor of New York is doing. Now, I've suggested elsewhere, and I will continue to recommend other kinds of readings for those who still find this far too complicated. It's not very complicated. It just means that you have to sit down and think, well, I use stuff, and there is stuff for use, but there's always a set of expectations or potentials for the objects that are not quite the same thing. And sometimes they have necessary contingencies. That if I have a tennis racket, I'm pretty much still screwed for having a game of tennis. You could sort of have a drill session with yourself, that is, it on an outdoor or indoor racquetball court or squash court, and that would sort of work, but it's not quite the same thing. I mean, the design of the activity itself is designed for a pair of people, which is a social relation of one kind or another. The abstraction, of course, is actually rules for the game and trying to determine how you're going to win or lose. It is ever more frustrating when you're in a community that only has racquetball courts and you want to play squash, because there are some very small features of the court that have to be different in order to play squash on it. And it's always a pain in the ass. On the other hand, it's a sign of elitism, and I can tell you stories. But anyway, the thing about Marx is, in terms of Capital Volume 1, is that, of course, it has numbered chapters, and chapter 1 is the big one that argues for this. So what today we're going to look at is, and I'm going to read through a kind of Cliff's Notes version, a summary, a guide by Simon Clark, one of many Marxists, of course. But he does a fairly decent guide. He does it in, I think, 76 pages. And that's kind of normal for getting summaries of Capital. There's one written by Shapiro that's also good. So reading these summaries are actually useful, because if you're really, sort of flummoxed by Higginbotham's lectures, although you can go back and watch all of the Volume 1 lectures again, they're not that problematic. I mean, once you get sort of this sense of what Higginbottom wants to do with them, to show that there is a connection between all three volumes, and that the argument has a certain logical consistency, and that you can't, or at least in his view, you can't sort of separate them out in some ways. They are, as I was talking the other day about, they are a kind of Borromean knot that you have to sort of deal with them all and not exclude anything. That doesn't mean to say that everything in there, fragments and absences, or all the pieces missing aside, you're still not going to get the thing itself. And especially since we're 150, 100 plus years in the future. The interesting thing, though, is, of course, we can always project and see that some of these things are the same today. One of the documents that is sort of mentioned and seems necessary is also another sort of synopsis, but it's written before capital. But it also has certain emphases, which is why it was used kind of as a standard text for a lot of people in a course where you're doing surveys or whatever, that this was a more comprehensive version, and it has different emphases because it happens a couple of years before capital. And you want to think about, well, there's this decade where Marx was writing all these different things, some of which get into print, others don't. And all of these different versions, plus the manuscripts Marx was probably toting around in his briefcase or whatever, is they are confusing, but not so much. I mean, when you think of, well, there's this earlier critique, it's kind of an outline, and then he gets to the kind of thing itself, which ultimately is edited later into another version, which sort of stacks a whole bunch of ideas into the first chapter, and appears, as Clark will mention, it looks kind of quantitative, but perhaps more important is that it is a combination of quantitative and qualitative. That is, the first chapter has 4 sections, and the sections are organized in such a way that you sort of get the sense that, oh, well, it has sort of a sciencey looking look to it, and that ultimately, if you consider sociology a science, which in fact it was problematic at the time, that this is kind of what's going on. That combination of quantitative and qualitative that's important. Noting, of course, that the quantitative elements are kind of limited, or they're very simple. They're not sophisticated in the sense that there's a whole bunch of other things that can be integrated into this to make it more like economics rather than philosophy or sociology or something. And that's used as a negative quality sometimes that people apply to it, a meta-criticism, as it were. So here's a description, an abstract for talking about the critique, but also talking about in general the issue of the basic issues. And it is this difference between the feudal and the capitalist modes of production. For Marx, the labor theory of value was not a theory of price, but a method for measuring the exploitation of labor. I think we can agree on that. It's not problematic at one level. At another level, what counts as exploitation? And is exploitation the same as, is it alienation or is it estrangement? The exploitation of labor, in turn, was important for explaining the production of a surplus in a capitalist economy. In a feudal economy, the emergence of a net product surplus to the consumption of producers and to the inputs consumed in production was palpable. In other words, you got a sense that that there are benefits or surpluses being produced. For the serf reproduced himself on his family plot of land during part of the week and then worked for the Lord doing the immense or corvée labor during the other part. These are required. These are unpaid obligations that are sort of the terms of tenancy, and you had to sort of you could do stuff on your own piece of land, but then you always had this obligation, and you could see that labor time could be involved in whatever day or half day that you were going to do on the Lord's time, so to speak. There was a temporal and physical division between production for subsistence for reproduction and production which generated an economic surplus and was appropriated by the Lord. Under capitalism, with the division of labor, such a demarcation no longer existed. Well, the demarcation exists, it's just made under more abstract terms. If capitalism is characterized by competitive markets where each factor is paid its true value, quote unquote, and no one makes a windfall profit by cheating his partner in exchange, oh, who would do that? How could a surplus emerge? In what manner could a sequence of equal exchanges transform an initial set of inputs into a larger quantity of outputs, with the surplus being appropriated systematically by one class, the capitalists? Marx's project was to explain the origin of profits in a perfectly competitive model, where each factor, including labor, received its competitive price in exchange. Now, that's kind of the ideal version of it. What Marx is talking about more is that there's something that goes on, and there are all these differences that are being created, and that ultimately somebody has to account for these things, and that these differences, this kind of asymmetry, irregularity, inequality becomes an inequality and becomes problematic, and perhaps you get social change as a result. And as Marx says in the preface, I think it's the preface to the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts, or the critique, whatever. The sketch of this course of my studies in the domain of political economy is intended merely to show that my views, no matter how they may be judged or how little they conform to the interested prejudices of the ruling classes, are the outcome of conscientious research carried on over many years, and certainly were, at the entrance to science. And this is where, what's his name, Roberts, William Clare Roberts is concerned about Dante. At the entrance to science, as at the entrance to hell, the demand must be made, qui se convien lasciare ogni sospetto, ogni vilta convien che chi sia morta, and that is from Dante's Divine Comedy. Here must all distrust be left, all cowardice must here be dead. You can imagine you can write an entire book on Dante's Inferno and Marx, which William Clare Roberts does. It's an interesting book. I don't think it achieved probably the fame that it's needed, but it is still interesting that for whatever reasons that you can sort of apply certain humanist ideas back into this, and it's signified certainly by the fact that Marx was well read, and he integrated a broad range of stuff into his work. He wasn't trying to be an economist. He was really teaching himself, as it were, political economy. And and it wasn't so much, as I've said before, Marx probably could have, well, he didn't really have accounting classes during that time period, but in fact, they probably could have done with a few math classes and a few accounting classes, and I think he would have probably come up with something better, whatever that means. So the contribution to the critique of political economy is written in 1859. It's available online. It has the general structure of what capital is about. That is, to talk about the commodity, to talk about money. It has the same overall kind of structure, right? And the devil is, of course, in the details. And you have, discussions of hoarding and world money and a variety of other things. And it's relatively short and still worth reading because it has its own little elements to it. But what we're going to look at, and what I will yammer a little bit on, is Simon Clark's Guide to Capital. These are the links to it. I don't know if we'll cover all of volume, that is pages 1 to 41. It's a 76-page document, and at least in this PDF form, and I'm not sure we'll get to 40, but I think we'll get along, and hopefully you'll get something out of it. So this is the link to get to the PDF. This is the first page, and I'll start here, but before I start, I'm going to describe that there are basic things that you can look at, and you may, when you're getting bored with my yammering, there's a manga version of Capital. Not that it's clear but it does exist, and there's several other. There's a Marx for Beginners by Smith that I put the image of before, so you may find that in this one, Marx's Capital for Beginners. It's a 1982 book and doesn't really need much updating. I mean, the fact is we've gone pretty far in working through different interpretations of capital, but the basic idea is pretty much the same. And the fact is, the details are somewhat interesting in that the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative are made clearer 100 plus years later, and that we've had a lot of social science that has been developed to sort of work through some of these issues, which is good. Bad in the sense that for every kind of bit of clarity, you get people who decide that they're going to take a theoretical stand, and this is the only way. This is just like religion, right? And that's why people criticize this stuff, that, you know, this is the only way to read the material, and we're at the current version of that kind of retcon approach to Marx, and that is by Kohei Saito, that is talking about, well, this is what Marx really meant, and this one word, because, you know, it's just too awful to get into the depths of it. But I think that the overall question of that we do need to keep rereading it, and particularly in the areas that have been less looked at for literally a century, and because some people said, you know, well, Marx is important. It's an important theory, but we need to get out there and work through this in society. So that some people who very much believe in Marx decided, well, you know, I got to make this clearer because we're actually trying to run a revolution here, and we got to sort of, you know, get everything to work properly. And so you can see the productivist bias that has existed for probably a century for Marx. And because it was intelligible, right? You had a working class who needed to be sort of, this is kind of what's happening to you. You need to sort of see how you're being exploited, et cetera, et cetera. That's a productivist side, but with greater knowledge, we suddenly discover, well, it's not all quantitative. It's a lot more qualitative. It does describe a certain kind of situation that is needed, that can evolve, that is possible to evolve. Now, whether it evolves by revolution or not is that another question that may not be embodied in the text itself. It is simply about, you know, the point in history that you arrive at, which has befuddled many people. People have staked out positions on whether, you know, Marx didn't really mean that. He really is a humanist at heart, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, that's the kind of thing you got to work through and not get too crazy about. So I introduced that idea. I give you the first page of Simon Clark's Guide to Capital, and then I'll switch in a second here to the text itself. Simon Clark's Guide to Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 1. Recall, of course, that there are several versions of books just on Chapter 1, so that's why it's really super important. It's at the front end, but it also combines, because of the editing, etc., angles notwithstanding, that all the ideas are sort of there, and some people just kind of worry about the front end of it and then hope that everything else is going to fit. The real problem, of course, is, as we've talked about before, that it's not quite as whole as that. It's kind of fragmentary, and I think there is a whole there, but you really got to, you know, as Higginbottom is telling us, you know, really got to look at all of these things because it's kind of uneven, and some things were put in for other reasons, for perhaps the wrong reasons, and you need to sort of work through some of those gaps in the text, and not trash Marx because he's, you know, it was an incomplete thing. It is because, you know, no one's going to have the perfect completion of this kind of idea. Anyway, the first chapter of Capital is both the most important in that it introduces the basic concepts of Marx's theory of value, and the most difficult. Marx first began to work out his theory of value in the Grundrisse, 1857, but the discussion there is very convoluted and incomplete. The first version of Chapter 1 of Capital is to be found in the Critique of Political Economy of 1859. I've given you the link above, whose first chapter is in many ways the best introduction to chapter 1 of Capital. So the best introduction is done years before it actually Capital actually gets printed. The discussion of the critique, that is the critique of political economy, or CPE as some people refer to it, differs in a number of ways from that of Capital. In the critique, Marx does not make the fundamental distinction between value and exchange value that is made in Capital. This distinction is an important one, and ultimately that it's not made in the critique, the CPE, shouldn't make a big deal ultimately, but you need to remember that. In the critique, the argument has a much more Hegelian flavor, and needless to say, we've been down this road before. It is more Hegelian. It makes more reference to the philosophy of right, et cetera, et cetera. The argument is entirely formulated in terms of the development of the contradiction between exchange value and use value. Note that he put exchange in brackets here. The way it's written is between value and exchange value, or value and use value. The way in which value is applied here is it's perhaps variable and not so ambiguous, but to other people it's quite ambiguous, and that value, as a quote unquote form, is kind of at risk through here. You just worry about that. You should be concerned yourself with that. It doesn't matter about form, as long as kind of logic, which also is a form, is also kind of worked through. Number 4, Marx devotes much more attention to money in the critique and in the Grundrisse than he does in Capital. The discussion of money in Capital refers the reader back to the critique, and that's a really important point. That is, in later Marxist approaches to the problem of money, that is, studies in the post-World War II period, it is this particular little weird idea that is the money thing is not fully worked out. And going back to the critique, sort of the CPE, helps to sort of work through that. Now, that's a big pain in the ass to a lot of people, but it does give some of the fundamental elements that are necessary. Well, once you start adding in the question of what's the role of the state and other forms of capital and blah, 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 things that are articulated much further down the road in like volume 3, for example. You need all of that because modern monetary theory is not based on the CPE, although I think some of the flavor of it is the CPE. Rather, it does need all of these other little elements in order to explain modern monetary theory. And the fact is, of course, that modern monetary theory by some people has, quote unquote, no relation to Marx, and that there's a whole literature on that as well. For a variety of reasons, whether it's revisionist simply not to get yourself in trouble or whatever, for political reasons, it's actually quite fascinating. That's worth an article too. The explanation of the theory of value in the CPE, the critique, is rather different from that in Capital. In the critique, the discussion of commodity fetishism is more closely integrated into the discussion of the theory of value. It is clear that for Marx, it is the qualitative rather than the quantitative dimension that is important, i.e., the theory of value is a theory of the way in which, through money and exchange, private labors are brought into social relation with one another. In Capital, volumes 1, 2, and 3, the exposition emphasizes the quantitative dimension first. That's why Simon Clark says, well, you got 4 parts. The first 3 are kind of quantitative. First, the theory of value as a theory of the ratio in which commodities exchange before discussing the qualitative dimension. So all of this is, may confuse you, but the fact is, when the first volume of Capital appears in 1867, the title gets kind of, it's just Capital, and sort of Critique of Political Economy is the subtitle, whereas it's about critique at the front end. And Radulski, in the study of the Grundrisse, this is a pretty big deal. This is that question that we've looked at for months here. the question of the humanistic approach, the post-World War II return to the humanist marks because of Stalinism, etc. Rudolsky is part of what people go back to when they see, oh, well, this thing didn't get widely distributed, the Grinders, and we got to start looking at this because this helps us get out of this sort of draconian, Stalinist thing. And the first rough draft of Capital in 1857 to 58, this is before the critique, right? This is the draft before the CPE. We discovered that the methodological importance of the idea of capital in general. He argued also that it retains its importance in any attempt to judge what is going on in the first 3 volumes of Capital given to us. These volumes comprise what was originally intended to be covered by the topic of capital in general, and this was to be followed by studies of competition and other things. That's the following plan sent to Ingalls in 1858. Note, this is right after the critique, right? Or the Grundrisse, and before the critique. Capital falls into 4 sections. Now, why is this at all important? It'll hopefully be important in a second here. Capital en general, this is the substance of the first installment. That is this general position on what capital might be. B, number 2, competition or the interaction of many capitals. There's no one capital, or there's capital in general, and then it is all these sub things: merchant capital, industrial capital, finance capital, etc. 3, or C, credit, where capital as against individual capitals is shown to be a universal element. This credit, as Graeber sort of is dealing with in his book on debt, the first 500 or 5,000 years, you don't have credit without debt. There's this thing, it's a big pain in the ass, but it is number 3. And number 4, which is important for us from a sort of post-Feldo point of view, because that's kind of where Feldo was yakking about, there should be some way in which the public or interest groups can own shares in a company to influence, or corporation to influence activities, to get to regulate them by this simple example. Now, it actually could be done, but it needs to be done in a much more complicated sort of perhaps draconian, perhaps revolutionary way, because in effect, to simply go through the process of dickering to buy shares, etc., only reinforces in a neoliberal way the whole system of buying shares and competing with other shares and making trades and propping up the entire brokerage system, which is an important Nader idea. I mean, if you see it from Nader to Feldo, and share capital is Marx could say, would agree, that it is the quote unquote most perfected form, turning into communism together with all its contradictions. So without getting into a long thing, I decided I would ask the artificial intelligence Gemini to tell us about, well, what would happen if the government seized corporate share capital? So this is the AI Gemini telling us what it thinks the answer is, which is not quite the answer, but it does have stuff between the lines, like all AI. Seizing all corporate share capital by the government wouldn't necessarily be a clear-cut case of socialism, but it has elements that move in that direction. Here's a breakdown. Socialism versus government ownership. Socialism is a broad term encompassing various economic systems. The core principles that the means of production, factories, resources, etc., are owned and controlled by the public or the state, with the goal of achieving a more equitable distribution of wealth, which is pretty much the bottom line for socialism. Government ownership of businesses doesn't automatically equal socialism. Some state-owned enterprises exist in capitalist economies for various reasons. Now, calling them public transportation or public utilities is often a real problem, because in some cases, the early forms of public transportation weren't quite public. They were, a quasi-public, I suppose. That they're oligopolies, if nothing else. You had multiple. There was Trailways bus system, and then Greyhound, etc. In utilities, California has two major utilities, Southern California Edison and PG&E, but there's a bunch of other little things. And if you're in the current stage of neoliberalism, neoliberal economy, people will try and sell you fractions of what essentially is still owned by one of the two duopolies. For example, it uses California as an example. There's in Connecticut, there's a single company that covers the entire state, but there are multiple sort of sub things that are playing with the market. And I don't want to get into a long thing there, but you can, own a power contract that is not with the main thing that essentially is all utilities in the state, for example. But it really is, and it's no different than in telecoms, where let's see, who owns Verizon owns what? I think Verizon owns Simple Mobile now. So anyway, there's a bunch of these examples where something is owned only by T-Mobile, and other things have been absorbed by Verizon, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what makes it socialist leaning? It is this question of public ownership we were just talking about. The government seizes all corporate share capital, essentially takes ownership of the means of production. This aligns with the socialist principle. Potential for redistribution. This widespread public ownership could be used to distribute wealth more evenly, another socialist goal. Why it might not be pure socialism. Implementation matters. It's how the government manages these seized assets is crucial. If they're run for profit or continue to exploit workers, wouldn't be true socialism. And then market absence. A purely socialist system often eliminates private ownership in markets altogether. This is the whole crux of the 20th century. Seizing capital wouldn't necessarily mean markets disappeared. So, we're looking at this combination question, which is taught in the standard courses, comparative courses, and that is that, it's a mixed economy. There are many mixed socialist economies where there is public ownership, there isn't public ownership, there's quasi-public ownership, particularly in the European economies, and then you have other kinds of ways in which you enforce this. Now, there are possible outcomes. State capitalism, this is the Chinese model, and the argument against the Soviet Union, for example, the government might become a giant corporation controlling businesses in a top-down manner. It's for example, even in Russia currently, I think you have still state quasi-state-owned enterprises that, for the defense sector. This wouldn't be democratic socialism, which emphasizes worker control and participation. And that's not what happens in either in Russian and Chinese state-owned enterprise capitalism, state capitalism. Transitional phase. It's possible that this seizure could be a step towards a new, more democratic socialist system where workers or communities have a say in how enterprises are run. This is that moment, that Feldo-Nader moment. Overall, seizing all corporate share capital would be a radical move with significant economic and social implications. While it shares some similarities with socialist goals of public ownership and wealth distribution, the specific implementation and management of these seized assets would determine how closely it aligns with the socialist system. Thank you, Jim. So that's the AI version of it. Needless to say, that could be refined a lot. So in looking at the Simon Clark Guide to Capital, and which I've just read the first thing, page 2. The version page 2, and I'm already at 6 o'clock. Let me just read a little bit and then we can stop. The version of the first chapter of Capital in the English translations is a revised version that first appeared in the third German edition. And the edition differences actually are a big deal relative to editing and changes of meaning. So, and then there's an appendix in the form of value that was integrated into the third section in the rewrite. The change was made in an attempt to make the first chapter more comprehensible, but it does introduce some differences in emphasis. So this is where it gets all crazy in the historiographic literature. And so, for example, here, a much better translation of the appendix has been published in Capital and Class in 1978. Now you can see how our understanding of capital still is contentious, I suppose, or contestable. Chapter 1 of Capital offers us a sociological theory of the market. Now, it's not purely sociology, and you don't reduce it to sociology, but does look at the question of social relationships, unlike someone who would assume that simply that the market can be abstracted into, monetary terms or utils or something else. Marx does not see the market simply as an institution in which individuals meet to exchange commodities, that is like a market, a village market town in the Middle Ages, but to be understood in isolation from the production of commodities, for exchange itself has implications for production. It is through the price mechanism that apparently independent producers are persuaded to produce in accordance with social needs. And you can see that mentioned above, that it's not always all uniform. You spend part of the day working for the Lord, but you've got stuff you want to do. If too much of a commodity is produced, the price falls and less will be produced. Producers will direct their labor into the production of other goods. If a producer is inefficient, he or she will not get full recognition in the market for the work he or she has done, and so will be compelled to increase efficiency. So there's this automatic drive for efficiency and productivity. Thus, the market is the place in which the labor of individual producers is brought into relation with that of other producers, and so of society as a whole. I mean, you could drive yourself to being productive without testing it against the market, but I think ultimately the market still has some relation to this as a function of your own knowledge in some ways. The market is a particular way of allocating social labor appropriate to a particular kind of society in which individuals work independently of one another to produce goods for the use of others. Thus, the relation between individual producers and a commodity-producing society is not directly recognized as a social relation. The producers do not get together to plan production as interdependent members of society. Instead, the social relation between these producers takes the form of a relation between things, between the goods they exchange from one another. The exchange ratio or exchange value of commodities is not therefore merely a relation between widgets, between inanimate objects, but it expresses the relation between the labors of the individuals who produce those commodities. This idea is the basis of Marx's theory of value. In other words, in every act of exchange, there are two kind of components. And without going into a huge thing on semiotics, you can just say that one version of it is simply communication. That is, you're taking things from point A or location A to market B, and therefore all the consumers can buy it at this particular location or whatever. What it also involves in that move of going A to B is also to tell people, to not only communicate that it is available, that you have access to it, but that there's a certain expression connected to it. That is, it's better than any other thing that's like it or whatever. And that's this component of the communication and expression, without getting into a long lecture on it, it is the way in which we can talk about language, a way in which we can talk about language. And that language, sometimes, look out, get the fuck out of my way, etc. But that, whereas I love blah, 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 whatever. So those kinds of things are at work. So in chapter 1, the theory of value introduced in chapter 1 is the basis of Marx's theory of capitalist society. Chapter 1 introduces the basic concept of the value itself is the most difficult to grasp. The chapter falls into 4 sections. The first section introduces the basic concept of value and use value. This value, remember, value is this nebulous kind of thing that gets clarified in later editions. The commodity, something produced for sale, and not for immediate consumption. It's not selling ice cream, you're selling, I don't know, a sword or something. It's both a use value and a value. So there's actually the big V value appears in the form of exchange value. And that's kind of how you assess it. So therefore, exchange value resembles in this procedure price in that way, but price is not always the same as value, as I've said before. So you have a couple of definitions here. It's therefore the physical body of the commodity itself, which is the use value or useful thing. 2 points. A thing is a use value if it can find a use. Thus, the term is not used evaluatively. A neutron bomb is a use value. It has other implications, but whatever. The term, number two, the term use value does not refer to how useful a thing is, but only to the physical properties that make it potentially an object of use. Thus, the use value of the commodity, it's simply its quality of being a thing. Okay? You know, I mean, I have plenty of uses that are possible with the neutron bomb, but, you know, it's just the neutron bomb is the neutron bomb. Disarming it is a whole different question. Number two, exchange value appears, first of all, as the quantitative relation in which use values of one kind exchange for use values of another kind. So that's what happens at basic, but it has other elements, of course, in the exchange itself. And that's kind of what Marx is trying to get at, is that there's these other things that happen in terms of constructing the big V value. Exchange value is the mode of expression, the form of appearance. And in fact, you know, that's what marketing, merchandising, blah, blah, blah is to the average business person, whatever. Three, the term value refers to the fact that as products of labor, commodities embody a certain amount of labor time. And we've seen this, I've already mentioned this before. This is the kind of first kind of sense that you have. Well, if we're going to measure this, how long did you work on it? Whatever. Value expresses the fact that the commodity is the product of social labor or of a part of the labor time of society as a whole, and not simply the private labor of a particular individual. Now, this is a key point, because you're not looking at it as simply, you know, what you're doing as a person just sort of toiling away, but rather there's some connection between the kind of, you know, procedures that you're using, pounding the piece of metal to make a knife or a sword, you know, and there's other people doing the same damn thing. And thus, the substance of value is human labor power in the abstract. Some people get hit harder than others. Homogeneous human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. The magnitude of value is determined by the labor time socially necessary to produce the commodity defined as the labor time required to produce any use value under the conditions of production normal. There's a kind of averaging going on here of a given society, and with the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in that society. Thus, the commodity is a thing, a use value that embodies a certain portion, but it's not, you know, this is not a container and a liquid in a container. It is, you know, the value is a much larger thing. It embodies a certain portion of society's labor time, a value. The second section, we're only to section 2, discusses the concept of abstract labor more fully, and I'll stop in a second because it's just simply important to get the difference between concrete and abstract labor. All of the things that I've described to you are pretty much more concrete. That is, you know, you're sitting here making the stuff. You're bringing it to market, you know, that all happens. You're standing around waiting for somebody to, you know, engage with, and they're going to make a deal with you, whether it's giving you a cow for your, you know, whatever you made, a knife, let's say, or whatever. That's just simply the basic set of activities. But the exchange value is more about, well, you know, is the cow really worth 3 beans or a bag of magic beans or whatever? That's where it gets kind of crazy, the idea of what counts as a kind of abstract value. Now, money helps us work through this issue, but it doesn't always answer the question. And in fact, it can make it more abstract in that particular context. So there's some definitions, sub-definitions for the concept of abstract labor. Useful labor is labor whose utility is represented by the use value of its product or by the fact that its product is a use value, that is, productive activity of a certain kind carried on with a definite aim, that is, making the knife. Again, the term is not used evaluatively. It just refers to the particular concrete characteristics of the labor that, you know, the spinner or the weaver that go into making the commodities a particular thing. In other words, the material's coming and you're sort of, you know, dealing with it, you know, making it more like a thread or whatever, yarn, before it goes on to the next step, for example. The value of commodity does not express these concrete characteristics of particular labors. Well, it can, but doesn't really. It expresses the common quality of labor as a social homogeneous labor, that is something as opposed to heterogeneous. Homogeneous labor, that is abstract labor, refers to the labor expended as different forms of the expenditure of human labor power measured by labor time, the basis on which different useful labors can be compared as simple expenditures of labor time is the fact that the same individual can perform a whole range of different kinds of useful labor. Note that in this section, the impression might be given that the concept of abstract labor is a physiological one. It's not about, blood and muscle and sinew. This is misleading. Elsewhere in the chapter, Marx makes it repeatedly clear that abstract labor is social labor. That is the expenditure of human labor power insofar as expenditure is socially necessary. This is the thing on which probably 50 years of argument have occurred. The expenditure of human labor power insofar as such expenditure is socially necessary. In this sense, the value of a commodity does not represent the amount of labor actually expended by a given individual. This is where the congealment argument gets screwed up. But that portion of social labor that is credited to that commodity. So it is the act of crediting, not the sort of congealment. That's why people get confused by this stuff. This cannot be discovered simply by looking at the time spent producing the commodity, for it is only in exchange that they find out how much his or her labor time was socially necessary. Ultimately, that's, what is my time worth when they're selling it for 10 cents, whatever. This is precisely what exchange does. It validates the socially necessary character of the labor power expended in producing a particular commodity as that commodity is compared in the market with others of the same or of different kinds. And this is in Rubin's work. This is this question of abstract labor. I think we'll come back to it. I'll probably spend a little more time on this because this abstract labor question that needs to be always kind of fleshed out, because when we talk about concrete, some people think of Portland cement or cinder blocks. That's not it. It is thinking a little more flexibly about what counts as using things, as being a human and using something, and how we value that particular thing in the context of use, its relation to others. It's always in that relation to others. It's a Borromean knot sense. The third section of chapter 1 returns from value to exchange value, and maybe I'll come back to all of this because I've used up my time. You can read this for yourself. There are links. I've tried to give a kind of way in which you can look at these different things, the relationships among things, and it will be probably better concretized, as it were, if you look at a couple of these more simple versions of this in illustrated versions of Capital. There are relatively simple ones, and you can go to Hadass Thier's example as well. She does a good example of that as well. And ultimately, the point of talking about chapter 1 is that you look at social relations of production, that there is a market. A lot of it is not original, as Simon Clark will say. Well, at some point, it's not that different from Ricardo. Where it is different from Ricardo is to talk much further about these abstract relations. That is, things that other forms of value, and that's kind of problematic. That at the end of this little first chapter thing, it will say that, if you just argue along a certain line about labor, you're essentially doing Ricardo's job, and so there are other things beyond labor time. There are other things that are count as socially necessary that Ricardo doesn't talk about at all. But the fact that there is this similarity will cause an entire body of interest about 50 years later in what is called neo-Ricardian interests, because it was kind of quantitative and you could sort of work through the commodity question, but Ricardo never pushed it beyond sort of singular commodities, whereas Marx's idea of commodity is a much broader concept. Now, being broader doesn't mean that it's more diffuse. It just means that it's more universal. You could say that Ricardo's approach to to the value question is much more singular and less articulated, crude, if you will, that Ricardo doesn't quite get. That's where the neo-Ricardians and other Marxists of a variety of types kind of occur. Is that some people begin to fixate on some of these things and they need it to be solid because you're trying to design an economy. So this is where it becomes at risk. And some people just make their decisions. Lenin kind of goes in one way and decides, well, it's all science. We should be able to do this. And we can organize it. It just, you just need everyone to fall into line and the party will decide. And that's kind of where it goes until, Lenin gets shot, Stalin takes over and things get screwed up, which is a simple way of approaching it. Okay, I've said enough. I hope that's clear. Is it? Was it? Hello?
Hello, it was great. Thank you.
Go ahead.
And I'm excited to kind of go back to some familiar territory and kind of, rehash something that we read seemingly, it has to be a few years now ago. So,
yeah.
And so without, wrestling with it and thinking about it, it kind of gets lost for me. So I do appreciate this. Now, are you going to work through Capital Volume 1 starting now? Is that it?
Yeah, well, we're doing a quick review because in about a week or two, we'll be up to lecture 5 on volume 2, but I'm kind of going to do this sub thing that reviews, because ultimately, as Higginbottom himself has said, when you get to volume 2, you're still talking about volume 1. I mean, you still need volume 1. So we're just going to continue to work through this. And Higginbottom has his own particular viewpoint, which has other issues, but generally is the 21st century version of how we should be sort of tackling the problem. It is more complicated because you have to think about all these different connections and that it's not a very singular linear object, but I think we can sort of appreciate why you can actually think that way if we go back and review volume 1. And as a famous Marxist once told me, you should be able to, a good Marxist should be able to explain Marxism in 30 minutes. You should be able to do a 30-minute lecture and kind of explain how it works. And that's an endless project. Imagine being trapped in an elevator.
Right. Then extended elevator talk, right? Yeah. Yeah.
It's an elevator pitch, except in about 30 minutes. You should be able to say, people are exploited or, disadvantaged. And, there are systems of redistributing this stuff. Some people don't believe in it. Some people believe that the market will do it. And it doesn't. It never does. It never has. It's given the appearance that it does, and we spend lots of time demystifying that. But really, let's just get to a sense where, some of our problems are simply because there are these simple differences that, if you're worried about migrants, the real problem is really much more not only at their home, but also in the social networks they've created that, some people are just getting their kids because they want to have their kids with them or whatever. It's much more complicated and whatever.
Well, as a great scholar said recently, the market is BS. So, and I'm reading from chat. So thank you, Pop-Fan. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. You didn't hear all my comments on weaponizing the other day. I always refer back to
you know what? I think I did. I heard you reference it once, and I was delighted. And I do go back and think about that because as we all are steeped in this horrible war and the information about it and fighting it. And it's really helped me, couch my arguments and understand what it's like to really be on the ground and the greater forces that are going against the Gazans and all. So thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly problematic, oh, we got 4 hostages back, but we killed 200 people, right? You're going, well, how is that a good thing? I mean, yeah, but what about all these? And they killed kids too. Were the kids armed, or
Yeah.
it just makes me mad.
Yeah.
The
And-
reporting will always talk about the number of Palestinian civilians that got killed in this particular exchange, and over focus at the front end on the 4 individuals who were, and I have nothing against the 4 individuals. They, one of them was quite prominent in terms of figuring in the front end of the stuff, but I mean, it's not an afterthought. 200 people dying so that 4 people get released. I just don't get this.
Right.
So anyway, thank you. Sorry, I digress. Anybody else? Brickbats? Interventions? I think Larry got called away to work. A 30-minute Looney Tune pitch. Yes, I can see that.
Well, only meant that I would like to see the content put in that format.
What content and what format?
The 30-minute explanation of Marx, and the format being the fun of the Looney Tunes.
Oh yes, well, I don't know.
I mean, if they can do it with Mega,
you get it. Well, you get it in Roger Rabbit. I think you actually get a kind of explanation of the whole issue.
yeah.
There's a little sequence in there where he sort of explain the end of the red line and blah blah blah. It kind of gets compressed in a certain spot there, so it actually can be explained with tunes.
No, that makes sense, because I saw that when it came out, and I was thrilled by it for that very reason. And I also like Jessica Rabbit. I'm not gonna lie.
Hey, people like curves, scams, whatever. Writing is at 7:00 in 40 minutes. I'm not sure whether timeout is or game time is extant tonight. I will say that from a sports point of view, the Celtics are ahead of the Mavericks by 2-0, and I assume there's a day off and then there's another game or something. I don't know. I haven't been paying attention, but Mavericks aren't close to the Celtics yet. So that's one thing. Other sports. Olympics is coming soon. There's Caitlin Clark is certainly not on the Olympic team. So they have other people who can shoot just as well. And so as much as there's all this marketing and et cetera, that's not going to happen for the Olympic team for basketball, women's basketball. Let's see, what else? The river is still polluted, the Seine. So I assume they must have a backup plan for a polluted Seine River. They can't be that stupid. Oh yes, the Russians have been accused of creating a propaganda of disinformation campaign, claiming that there's going to be tons of violence in Paris. They may even try and cause violence in Paris, but the reality is there's no violence in Paris, and all they're devoting, as most governments do, tens of thousands of troops to make sure that doesn't happen. But it is interesting that there is a disinformation campaign with bots and everything to scare Jews from showing up at the Olympics, invoking Munich, blah, blah, 1972, et cetera, et cetera. Very stupid stuff is going on. So anyway, there will be writing at 7 and hopefully sports after that. I hope, I'm not sure what else is on the schedule and I didn't look. Please correct me if there's any of those kind of things going on. And I was being, of course, shots about drugs and dopiness. The market for drugs is actually still quite fascinating to me. And it's more fascinating if you have television or you want to look up Net Geo has a whole series on smuggling that is quite fascinating. I'm always fascinated by that. It's because they're essentially about police forces putting the clamps on people who get caught, and the people who get caught are only mules. They're all, none of them are kingpins. So they're just, these poor bastards who decided to make extra money for X number of reasons and really don't have good excuses when they're caught. So half the interesting part of it is the dissection of luggage or whatever, or wherever they're hiding it, including in their bodies, which is a whole nother interesting question. Whatever. It's quite interesting. Anyone else?
Well, just one thing about the smuggling and looting. I just found out that there's going to be an online museum of smuggled and looted art and artifacts. So that's right up my alley. So
it's a tremendous set of issues. And in fact, some of these there's a Net Geo series that talks about the U.S. CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol, intercepting, for example, artwork. It's really quite fascinating.
Yeah, and I gotta say,
the question of smuggling artwork, and then the Freeport component of artwork, and then there's the dominant institutions of artwork, and then there's the auction system. All of that's quite fascinating. And then, of course, the looted art that needs to be returned, and along with remains and shit like that. That's just, well,
yeah.
All of the results of colonialism or imperialism, and it's still there. I mean, it's every couple of years somebody catches a big institution like the Met spending $5 million or $10 million on a widget that is clearly a forgery or false or fake or whatever.
Sorry. But
Okie dokie. I assume there's no other commentary, and I'll let you get time